All right, so we're live, and good morning, colleagues, and welcome to episode 6 of the Guyana Business Journal and Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I'm Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York and founder of the Guyana Business Journal. As usual, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. David Lewis, of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Manchester Trade Incorporated. As many of you know, this series, Transforming Guyana, brings together experts and prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, the diaspora, and around the world to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We aim to offer a nuanced look at the opportunities and potential pitfalls ahead for Guyana, and we explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts of the oil revenues that Guyana can have on Guyana's people and future, while mitigating the risks that other countries have faced. We also, since we're in the diaspora, try to identify the most promising roles for the Guyanese diaspora in this momentous transition. Today, we examine Guyana's role in a world that still needs oil. And if we ever doubted the importance of this, we noted that on October 26, ExxonMobil announced 2 new discoveries at Sailfin 1 and Yarrow 1 wells in the Stabroek Block offshore Guyana, which is sort of added to the extensive portfolio of development opportunities. For those of you who are non-Guyanese and joining this, ExxonMobil has made more than 30 discoveries on the block since 2015 and has really ramped up offshore development and production at a pace that really far exceeds the industry average. So this question of Guyana's role in a world that still needs oil is one that really needs kind of an exploration. By way of context, we also want to make mention of the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, the Loan Guarantee Program, which aims to increase lending to individuals and households, small and medium enterprises, and larger companies across the Caribbean for small-scale non-oil energy projects, including renewable energy power generation and distribution and energy efficiency, and what are euphemistically called green mortgages. We should also note the outcomes from the Summit of the Americas recently held in Los Angeles, where the heads of government approved really 5 official political commitments related to health, climate change, clean energy, digital transformation, and democratic governance. And so today, we're really trying to figure out, how does Guyana thread this needle? And our conversation will be led by Roger Craningberg, Vice President, Energy Strategy and Policy at Eversource, Anthony Bryan, Senior Fellow of the Institute for International Relations at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago, Dax Driver, the CEO and President of the Energy Chamber of Trinidad and Tobago, and Lorraine Sobers, lecturer in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Petroleum Studies at the University of West Indies. Regrettably, we were supposed to be joined by Bobby Gosai, Senior Petroleum Coordinator and Petroleum Management Program in the Ministry of Natural Resources in Guyana, but Mr. Gosai has some immediate pressing challenges that preclude his attendance today. So we will first have a few words from our co-host, Dr. David Lewis, and then remarks from Dr. Anthony Bryan as we begin. Dr. Lewis.
Good morning, Terrence and colleagues on the webinar. Those seeing and listening to us in the region, in Guyana and internationally, thank you for joining. I think we're at halfway point. This is our sixth episode out of 12 programmed once a month, and we've been doing very well. So many thanks to those who have been participating with us over the various topics. I'd just like to mention 4 quick points not necessarily to feed into the commentaries we will get from our experts, but to keep in mind as we do have discussions, both between ourselves and online, regarding this whole issue of a world that still needs oil, where Guyana fits in, what this means in terms of energy security for Guyana and the region, and the impact this has in terms of the daily lives of people in Guyana. First of all, in addition to the issues you mentioned, Terence, from the Summit of the Americas just in June this past year, I think it's important that one of the big deliverables out of that at the bilateral level between the US and the Caribbean are three commitments to advance collaboration and development, one of which is in the area of energy security, the other two in food security and development finance. So it's clear that at least between the US and the Caribbean relationship, there is a lot of high-level attention being paid to the energy situation. Secondly, this also then needs to be meshed with what has been up to now a position of the Biden administration to wean ourselves away from fossil fuels somehow, and really, for lack of a better word, a kind of anti-hydrocarbons focus. This, of course, has been brought to global attention because of the Russian war on Ukraine and the impact this has had on energy markets, both oil and now with the winter coming, natural gas. And this is something important to bear in mind because particularly as a newcomer and given these new discoveries and the massive unprecedented growth of the Guyana energy market in oil, but eventually in gas as well, and the impacts in the rest of the Southern Caribbean, Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago particularly, it's important, we believe, to have a bit more of a balance in terms of what it means to nurture this initiative, particularly because of the impact on the fiscal and economic improvement, not only for Guyana, but the region as a whole. So the third point is that this has serious regional, hemispheric, and global implications in terms of the economic well-being and the need for oil and gas. Fourth point really is, how does this then fit in with the daily lives of energy producers and consumers in Guyana, and particularly those of you who have listened to me in the past, my pet peeve of what this means for Guyana, but also for the rest of the Caribbean, of the necessary and imminent modernization of the grid and the utility system in the region to really take advantage of this largesse and make the utility and grid system in Guyana and the Caribbean the most energy efficient, energy diverse, and technologically advanced in the world. There is no reason that this cannot be achieved. It just dawned on me as a final point, and then I'll move on, and may be interesting to get commentaries from people. We are missing Mr. Gosai, but I'm sure he can join us for a future event. But it is important institutionally. Guyana still does not have a Ministry of Energy. Everything is being run out of the Ministry of Natural Resources. This, I understand, has to do with the commitment of the government to really emphasize the climate change, environmental, natural resource aspect of things. But it makes me wonder if at some point, given the growth and the importance of oil and gas and the whole energy boom, if indeed Guyana does not need a Ministry of Energy just to handle this directly. So I just throw that out there for commentaries and feedback eventually. So again, thank you all for joining us. We will now be led off by my colleague from the Caribbean Policy Consortium, Anthony Bryan, and we look forward to the next 45, 50 minutes of discussion. Thank you again, Terence. Thank you all.
So, Professor Bryan, the floor is yours. So I think your mic is muted. So you might be muted. Can you unmute your mic?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. Okay. I'm simply going to address the question that you posed to me about Guyana's energy strategy in the Caribbean. And it's a subject that occupies some thought because I don't know exactly where Guyana wants to go, but I'm going to take a shot at it. Could we have the next slide, please? Yes. Now, there is a Caribbean imperative for renewable energy. And these are the elements that are involved. The sustainable development goals to which Caribbean countries are committed. They require sustainable renewable energy and integrated energy objectives. Secondly, the climate change crisis for SIDS and low-lying coastal countries requires an urgent shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy options in order to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2030. Sorry, by 2050. As the Paris Climate Change Agreement, all Caribbean countries to NDC target for reducing carbon emissions by 2030 as part of climate change mitigation. Just a couple of days ago, in Egypt, Caribbean leaders called on wealthy developed nations to pay for economic and environmental damages to LDCs and SIDS and to contribute financially to climate justice, as Prime Minister Mia Mottley terms it. Next slide. Well, this is just a recap very briefly. We don't have to go into any detail, but the CARICOM Energy Policy 2013 provided a roadmap for the region's shift to renewable energy through the increased use of RE energy sources and improvement in energy efficiency. All CARICOM countries are required to have at least 47% renewables by 2027. And all have completed national energy policy and resilience. As you can see, the commitments have different timelines in terms of the percentages that countries expect to reach by 2030 and 2050. I think of direct importance here to us is that Guyana has developed a low carbon development strategy to provide the framework for Guyana to pursue its energy transition, a new industry to provide the revenues to help Guyana provide a high standard of living for its citizens to climate adaptation and mitigation. I mean, the problem is perennial. As we know, these projects require high initial capital. And the small markets are a limitation to concessional financing or global venture funding. The next. Now, how do we get from here to there? I am perhaps sanguine enough to suggest that there are some possible actions for Guyana as it weaves its regional energy strategy. And the first, of course, has to do with the forests, which have created environmental space for simultaneous development of its oil resources and its net carbon sink credentials. So, bluntly, Guyana should capitalize on the leverage that this conjunction offers as the world moves to net zero. There are some other elements that I think I don't want to sound as though I'm telling the Guyanese what to do, but these are just some possible actions as the strategy is developed. I think put all Guyanese and Caribbean people first. And all ethnic groups are equal in this trajectory. We know that the country has a problem with ethnic rivalry. It's not alone in that regard, but I think oil and possibly gas may be the glue, if you will, that brings the ethnic groups together rather than dividing them. The other point is do not inflate already enthusiastic domestic or regional public expectations. There's a lot of hype going around, whether it's in the media, whether it's the politicians, whether it's promising this, that, and the other. But domestic and regional public expectations have to be monitored, and they have to be, in fact, controlled. Otherwise, promises are going to fall short. Be careful of strategies that try to do too much too quickly and tend to fall short or fail. I've seen a lot of discussion about strategies that are offered. They made as political pronouncements. Exxon, for example, makes suggestions about this, that, and the other, and that's the government. Well, trying to do too much too quickly and promising too much too quickly is probably going to fall short or fail. Another issue is, of course, choose carefully when using resources to solve infrastructural problems. Everything doesn't have to be built in a day. It can take time. It should be well planned and well structured. Do not focus just on immediate problems, but look at opportunities for long term. There is a lot to be found and created in this age of artificial intelligence, and in this age where things change very rapidly, and one has to be sure that the long term is in focus. I think one of the important areas is to build global partnerships to advance the development of Guyana and the CARICOM region. We don't have a monopoly on technology or anything of that sort, and we need to have global partnerships. But of course, they should be done with correct terms of reference. Then compete internationally with Guyana's cheap energy for industrial capacity in tandem with similar regional producers. I think the issue of a refinery is one of those things that has to be dealt with, to say nothing of the gas to shore options, which are costly, but if they result in cheaper energy, then so be it. Invest heavily in agricultural business for the region. I think it's estimated that 25% of CARICOM's food production can be met by Guyana. The figure is probably more than that. So it should be done. There's a splendid future for agricultural industries. As I suggest, we can create new jobs in food processing, in fertilizers, in petrochemicals. We should also accelerate investing in traditional economic drivers, such as mining, oil and gas, manufacturing, insurance, real estate, etc. And finally, I think strategies have to be built for low carbon business models and articulate these strategies to markets. That's where one gets, of course, a competitive advantage. I will offer one sort of constraint, and that is this: we should not be led by the idea that oil and gas is a precondition for economic development for the future. It is just an enabling factor for further development. It has a short life, really, certainly in terms of employment and so on. And we have to remember as well that oil and gas producing economies do not necessarily fare better than non-oil economies. The resource factor or the resource curse is manifested in behavior by elites, inequalities between ethnic groups and between districts. And final thing, I think we have to be very clear about the dilemma of investment versus divestment as the world moves towards net zero. The final slide. Thank you. Okay, so what might the future look like for the renewable energy efforts of Guyana and CARICOM circa 2030? I take a shot at it. This is what I see. Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Suriname are cooperating, pooling their extractive energy resources into networks to benefit electricity demands in CARICOM. That is a point that David Lewis has stressed time and time again about having a regional grid. Secondly, CARICOM nations are still very minor contributors to the global carbon footprint and climate change. And in 2030, they are continuing fossil fuel production as a funding pathway to renewable energy. I think also oil and gas are playing a key role in these economies as they invest incremental portions of their revenue from oil and gas into renewable and sustainable energy in order to meet their announced renewable energy goals for 2030. I also have a vision that other regional countries such as Venezuela, Colombia, French Guyana, Barbados, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Grenada may become part of a Southern Caribbean energy matrix that uses oil and gas. This is just a vision. Hopefully I live long enough to see it. Thank you very much, Terrence.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Brian. Roger Cronenberg, does Professor Brian live long enough to see this vision of Venezuela, Colombia, French Guyana, Barbados, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, Southern Caribbean energy matrix emerge?
I would say absolutely, Dr. Brian. I think your vision will be realized, and very much in your lifetime. So let me jump into it, right, Terrence?
Yes, it's your ball now.
Excellent. So before I jump into it, so for full disclosure, Terrence mentioned my title. That's my day job. In doing this, I do this on a very personal basis. This is my company has no interest in Guyana, so I just want to make that very clear. I've been asked, what's Eversource's position in Guyana, and I just want to make it very clear that I'm doing this personally. For folks that know me, I was born in Guyana. I was raised in the U.S. and spent time in Europe, etc. And most of my career, having grown up in Houston, has been in the energy space. So that's where my perspectives, I'd like to share my perspectives from that. I'm a QC boy, so I sort of go back to my roots on that. But it has been a long time since I left Guyana. So with that, Dr. Brian covered a lot of great ground. I'll sort of touch on my commentary on it, starting with oil. I had the pleasure of working for one of the masters of the global oil, the energy space, expert on energy and geopolitics and intersection of it, etc. A gentleman by the name of Daniel Yergin. So starting with oil, energy throughout history, and especially in the age of petroleum, has been intertwined with geopolitics. Dan wrote the classic book, The Prize, which won a Pulitzer Prize, that sort of plays out that history of the intertwining between energy, especially petroleum, and geopolitics. Currently we're seeing that play out in Europe with Russia, both in terms of natural gas as well as oil, and the dynamic on the oil market. In terms of sort of Guyana's play on that, I think it's a very key play and benefit to the world, not just the Caribbean or not just the Americas, but what the world needs is a more diverse supply of energy. And in this case, we're starting off with oil. Luckily, over time, U.S. oil production has ramped up, and it's given a lot of benefit to the world to diversify the world's oil supply. And without that, I think the situation we're seeing right now in the global energy market, together with some of the geopolitical tensions and stresses that we're seeing, without Texas ramping up, which is where I grew up, ramping up oil production, what we're living today would be much, much worse for the entire world. So, starting from that, Guyana's role is very much welcome globally to diversify the world's oil supply. If you look at projections, IEA, for example, there's an expectation that oil will be around for, the base expectation is oil demand will be around for some time to come. I took a quick look at the IEA base projection, and it shows oil demand consumption, somewhat sort of flat from here out to 2050, if I recall that rightly. If you break that down, what that shows is you're probably going to see a reduced demand for petroleum products, fossil fuel, and petroleum products in developed world, be it the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, in places like Japan, Korea. You'll probably see the demand for oil, petroleum, reduce over time. But what will balance that out is demand for oil in the developing world. So the net of all that in IEA projection is somewhat flat oil demand. So there will be baseline expectations is there will be demand for oil for some time to come. So the world would very much welcome a diverse oil supply. But with that said, as you've seen and you've heard from Dr. Brian, the world is also very steadfast on decarbonizing, and this is kind of a natural trend as you progress in development. And you look back through history, the world has always moved away from carbon-intensive fuels. Early days it was wood, coal, etc., to less and less. You can think of environmentally intensive fuels. So the caution I would offer is don't just, and this is part of my sort of development where I worked at before, we looked at the future through scenarios. And what that gives you is the ability and the preparation to be successful in a variety of futures. A baseline expectation I shared with you, but with society's focus on decarbonizing, one of the other IEA scenarios is net zero by 2050. There's a lot of lessons to be learned in that scenario. One lesson is don't be completely dependent on oil for some time to come. Dr. Brian shared with us sort of the dangers of the resource curse. So the lesson there is use this benefit that you have today, definitely make the best use out of it, but work to develop a diversified economy. And if you look today, economies that are just dependent on resources are tough economies to run effectively, even if they are very, very wealthy. So diversify your economy. Take this gift and invest it for the future. And I've got a few ideas I'm willing to share on that. And part of that future may be you produce oil, but you abate the CO2 emissions. So there's potentials there. They're exploring those in North Sea. They're exploring those in the Gulf Coast. So not something to really focus on right now, but looking into the future and saying there's a very strong possibility that the world is going to drive towards a decarbonized future. How do we play in that future? And in my day job, I very much do this in strategy is, not putting all your eggs in one basket of this is going to be the future, because the reality is no one really knows exactly what the future is going to look like, but make sure your strategy is robust in a range of futures and you understand, how you will play in a range of futures. So that's a piece of sort of advice I would offer Guyana in looking at its sort of forward-looking energy strategy. Energy is here to stay. Fossil energy is here to stay for some time in a base scenario. But again, the world is very much focused on a decarbonized future and getting there as best as we can. And for society, I think it's a good thing. And then you can get some technological breakthroughs. This is really stretching your imagination, but I'll share with you, I think there's a real possibility of a completely new source of energy. Just outside of Boston, where I live, they're currently constructing a fusion reactor. And if you play out and what that could mean to the global energy space, it could have a massive impact on the global energy space. It's not a given by any means, but I was asked to speak at a conference in New York City. And it was a bit of an eye-opener. It was hosted by one of the large banks. It was 100 people from around the world, all looking at fusion. And if you play out how that could impact the global energy world, it's something to consider when you're looking out into the future. And getting a little bit more grounded, and this is sort of a deep part of my expertise, is electricity. And some of this you've probably heard me share my views on before. I think Guyana has a very bright future on leveraging what's essentially a waste product or limited value product in the associated gas in those fields. The oil dynamic, it's going to the international market. My personal view is, economically, it doesn't make a lot of sense for Guyana to invest in refining. These are global markets, and you pick what your play in that market. And I can go into that more in the Q&A if necessary. But let's accept that my view that the oil goes to the global market. The current volumes of gas and where it's located, that's tough to put on the global market. It may change in the future, but right now, that gas is essentially a low value, at best, low value commodity. So bring that to shore, and that's the gas to shore project. I'm a very strong supporter of it. I would very much like to see Guyana move forward on that project. It may seem expensive, but if you play out Guyana's future well, it could be such a prosperous future that the expense will be nominal compared to sort of what the benefits could be derived. And then you play that out further. Someone mentioned the blackouts in Guyana. And looking at some of the data, I think a lot of that's associated with the generation. So once you get the gas to shore, you strip off the propane, you offset propane imports, you use that gas to generate electricity, and you do it through what's called air derivative turbines. They're used on the FPSOs right now. They're small turbines. They're highly reliable. They're basically jet engines that are used on airplanes. And then, I think that's half of the reliability right there. And then the rest is upgrading some of the infrastructure. And then go to electric vehicles. And that may seem like a stretch, but my cousin sent me a photograph of a Tesla 3 in Guyana, which was very pleased to see. And there's a lot of cars coming on the market. Hyundai is making some great moves. I track that in my day-to-day job, and we're hit about a 4% threshold in the US. And what you see is in technology adoption, when you hit the 4 to 5% threshold, the adoption curve really takes a turn. So it's a global trend that you can benefit from. And if you get a reliable, I'd put a lot of emphasis on reliability electric system, it's the primary input for a high value add economy, high value add societal items like healthcare, education. I'd put a lot of emphasis on that. And then in the renewable future, and this played out in Texas as well, if you've got a system that's run off of gas, it actually makes it very much able to integrate renewables effectively. Some of the largest amounts of onshore wind in the US and the world is in West Texas. And part of that is, they have the resource, but a big part of that is they have the electric system that's flexible because it's a gas system to be able to absorb a lot of renewables. The renewable that I find very exciting for Guyana is solar. We're doing a lot of that in this region. A lot more sun in Guyana than there is in New England. But with that, I think I'll pause, Terrence. So that's my views. I think it's an extremely bright future for the country. If some of the good strategies and planning and execution is done, and it really has to benefit the economy broadly for it to be a bright future, and bridge the racial divide that we all know. I think that's going to be key for the future success of my home country, my birth country.
Well, thank you, Roger. So invariably, this social dynamic of this question of race and in some larger sense, a question of governance is emerging. Dr. Sobers, I'm trusting that you're there. Do you want to pick up the discussion at this place?
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
So my approach to this will be to focus on the domestic energy security and the policies and regulation for power generation in particular, right, for Guyana. So I'll start off with a scenario. Earlier this year in April, I believe it was, I virtually attended the AmCham, Guyana AmCham roundtable discussion on energy. And during the Q&A session, it was quite interesting to see the number of people who were asking questions about selling energy back to the grid. And so those questions were directed to the Guyana Power and Light CEO, Mr. Bharat Dindia, and he pointed out some interesting things. One, that there's no legislation provision available for feed-in tariffs, that is FITs. Even if such legislation was in place, there's very limited opportunity for stakeholders to participate because the grid is limited to just hosting 50 megawatts. Also, the customer billing system is not currently configured for the financial accounting needed to facilitate payment to producers and people who will be interested in selling to the grid. And furthermore, for the power transmission and distribution, $3 billion US would need to be invested in the next decade in order to upgrade and expand the current power transmission and distribution system. And recently, he basically went on to say that the grid is not designed for including renewables at this point in time. Right, so that's the scenario, and I'll come back to that. And I want us to think about this as we look at what the CESI can offer in this situation for Guyana in particular, and how it would play off possibly with the rest of the region. So energy security, I would use the definition from the International Energy Agency, and that is the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. And there are several aspects to energy security. On the long term, we're looking at timely investments to supply energy. And on the short term, we're looking at focusing on a system that could promptly respond to sudden changes on the supply-demand balance. So for Guyana, I'm also quite excited to see how the gas to power would play off and change things and lower costs and so on. And so that gas to power, as you know, would be using gas from the Liza phase 1 and phase 2 fields, and that project is estimated to last 25 years. The good thing about it, well, it's contributing to the energy security in the long term. It's cleaner energy than fuel oil, which is currently being used for electricity generation, is a domestic supply. On the other side, I mean, significant investments for the pipeline to make happen. The good thing is that overall the fuel oil import bill would be drastically reduced, and that would help offset some of that. We can hope that this would increase the reliability of electricity supply, and it's overall better for citizens and for business. Now, electricity is an important part of energy security. It's like intrinsically linked because the cost of energy affects every facet of our modern society, linked to power generation and also the transportation. But we only deal with power generation today, or at least I am. And countries like Guyana in the past that have relied, and currently, that rely on ports for exposed market volatility, and it can really hamper development goals. But the good news is that Guyana has taken the steps to emerge from that state of energy insecurity, is what I would call it, by becoming a net exporter of crude and, of course, pursuing its low carbon development strategy. And that includes the gas to power and renewable energy. Now, going to the security initiative, that's the CESI. I've taken this directly from their website. Their aim is to boost energy security through a focus on improved governance, increased access to finance, and strengthen the coordination among energy businesses. And I want to focus today on improved governance in particular. Now, when they drill down into what we mean by improved governance, considering specifically targeting technical and policy assistance programs to put in place the legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks required to introduce new technologies and approaches to managing electricity load in small island markets. Now, the motivation for being part of this initiative is for Guyana is that Guyana really needs reliable power generation and distribution. It's critical to, so many services spanning from healthcare to communication to commerce. It's critical for the development going forward. So in the next decade, what are we looking at? We're looking at increasing demand, increased demand. So the demand is forecasted to increase from a current peak of 125 megawatts thereabout up to 260 megawatts by 2025. And then by 2035, there's a further 10 years down from 2025 by 400 megawatts. The other challenge in the next decade is the decarbonizing of the power generation, and where the gap comes in. Also, hydropower, solar, wind, and biomass. The other challenge in the next decade, then these are challenges that come with the 21st century way of setting up things, that with digitalization of any system, we have to consider cyber attacks. And also in the 21st century going forward, we have to consider the infrastructure and its ability to stand more extreme weather events with climate change. So overall, Guyana desperately needs a decentralized and flexible electricity grid with built-in redundancy. So how can CESI objectives be achieved through updated policies and regulations for power systems in Guyana? And this is when we come back to that example where we see that we really have challenges with policy legends to make things happen. So Guyana's power sector has to be reconfigured to meet demand for the centralized systems of thermal power plants, which are currently in place, to facilitate the input of multiple renewable energy producers. Multiple producers and variable renewable energy sources would ensure that there's resilience built into the system, and so we have energy security. Improved governance in this instance, of that example, means that the policies and the legislation needed to be developed and updated. So the technical and policy assistance through the CESI can assist in building resilience and facilitate access to financing projects of varying sizes. Through the CSI, the US is providing up to $20 million in grant funding to help, and I'm quoting, to help promising projects address early stage development challenges and achieve bankability. So we want those to be financially viable. The GPL, that's the Guyana Power, with the government support, needs to identify the stakeholders interested in providing energy to the grid and coordinate efforts to make FIT, that's feed-in tariffs, a reality in Guyana. The feed-in tariff legislation and regulation are areas that the Guyana government can work with regional bodies such as the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, that is CRE, to strengthen the nation and other CARICOM members. So the CESI is also working with CARICOM, and we can look to neighbors like Barbados who have made advances in that area. This comes down to one of the things that I see over and over again when I consider any situation with Guyana is that governance is really important. The focus of the CESI, or CESI, sorry, the CESI is an opportunity for Guyana to bolster its strategy on local development, and it's evident that even from the objectives set out for a regional initiative, that good governance is really important for Guyana's progress. I really think it's one of the fundamental issues, and that's the contribution I have for today.
Professor Sobers, I can listen to you all day. I always feel like I get an education when I invite you to sort of speak on these matters. I mean, I think you created a nice intersection of governance, energy resilience, the CESI, and sort of Guyana's long-term trajectory as a resilient oil producer that sort of in some way moves to renewables. And tax driver, the question here is, Dr. Sobers has laid out a really kind of granular vision about how this thing should emerge. And I want to ask you to kind of somehow take stock of all of you've heard and to kind of help us to thread the needle here.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if I can help thread the needle, but it's quite a complicated one to thread. But just listening to the presentations, and I thought, what I wanted to do is try to put the presentations into a global context. And when I was listening to the three main presentations we had, there were four sort of themes which I saw coming through, where there's a global context which then is impacting on Guyana and on the Caribbean and more widely. So the first area that I just wanted to highlight a little bit, it's been touched on, but I think it needs perhaps a little bit more of a discussion around would global capital markets and also the relationship between those capital markets and attracting investment. Then the issue around food security and the nexus between energy security and food security, which I don't think is always fully appreciated. Then something around technology and how technology is being developed and how quick things are moving and the implications of some of that. And then finally, the global geopolitics and how that sort of could be impacting on the region and on the role of Guyana, but then also the role of the wider Southern Caribbean. So first of all, on the capital markets, I think one of the things that's really important just to really emphasize is that there is this now. There is a fight for investment dollars within the major oil and gas producers, and there's a lot of there's a big fight that goes on within those companies about where that capital is going to be allocated, because companies are wary of where they're allocating capital because of climate change and the push for net zero. So you're seeing companies being very disciplined about their capital allocation. Clearly, it's different in this current high price environment compared to previous high price environments. You're not seeing an exuberance by the international oil and gas companies about them pursuing new deep water projects all over the world and splashing out on exploration. People are being very disciplined. So people are making decisions about where they're going to allocate their capital because of this concern about the long-term demand for oil and natural gas. So clearly, Guyana has been, up to now, highly attractive, and that's partly because of the structure of the production sharing agreement. which is in place, the main one where all of the finds have been. But another thing I would also emphasize is the speed of development. Really unprecedented how fast Exxon and their partners have gone, working with the government of Guyana from a find to production. This has happened much faster than elsewhere, and that speed of development adds huge value to the resources in a country. So we did a little study in Trinidad a couple of years ago when we looked at the net present value of a typical offshore shallow water gas field, the sort of fields that we have in Trinidad. Now, typically at the moment is about 7 years from an exploration find to first gas. If you could speed that up by a year, you'd add about $110 million in NPV just by speeding up the approval process by a year. So that ability to move fast from exploration to bringing fields into production is really important. The other thing which I think we're seeing happening is because of this high price environment and generally sentiment, anti-fossil fuel sentiment, which David Lewis was sort of talking about a little bit in Europe and in North America, you have this push for windfall taxes. And so it's interesting how that's going to then, I think, play out in countries which are competing for capital. Because clearly, if we were in somewhere like Trinidad to put a windfall tax, and we have a windfall tax on oil, but if you had an additional windfall tax, and then you see no further investment taking place, so that's a balance which countries are going to have to get right. How do they extract value in this environment of the world moving towards net zero and this intense competition for capital within upstream oil and gas? Just the first point around capital markets and the fiscal regimes as well, which then exist. Second point around food security, obviously, within the Caribbean, Guyana is seen as having this very strong a role in producing food security because of its land holding. But I think what people often miss with food security is the nexus between food security and energy security, because food security, global food security, relies upon natural gas as a feedstock to fertilizers. They're taking the hydrogen atom from methane, adding it with nitrogen and making ammonia, which is then the basis for fertilizers, and that has allowed the world to have 8 billion people because of the ability to do that. And so I think that's just not known by people, the role of natural gas in creating that food security for the world. So I think that then is an interesting question, and Trinidad has been integral to that. I mean, we're a major producer of ammonia. We are one of the world's biggest exporters of ammonia, play a big role in that. That's that the natural gas was produced there, but obviously there's a big drive now to decarbonize that, because when you produce when you take the hydrogen atom from the methane, you're then producing CO2, which a lot of which goes into the atmosphere. So the fertilizer industry has been a major point source of CO2. So the big move to try to move away from that, and this is where a lot of the talk around green or blue hydrogen going into the petrochemical sector comes from. Green hydrogen from renewable energy, green electrons, then synthesizing water, so you get your hydrogen atom from H2O rather than from methane, and then you add that to the nitrogen, and then to produce ammonia. So people talk about hydrogen as an energy source, but it's this vital role within food security because of its role within fertilizers. So the potential of green hydrogen, I don't know if that's really being. I think there will be potential down the line in Guyana for some of these technologies. Perhaps first of all from traditional grey hydrogen into ammonia, like we do in Trinidad. There's also potential for blue hydrogen, where you're taking the CO2 and you are sequestering that through carbon capture and sequestration. But so there is this nexus between particularly natural gas and food security, which I think is missed, and I think that that's an important part of the whole conversation that we need to have around the role of Guyana within the energy matrix. It's not just production of fuels; it's also the production of fertilizers as well. On the technology development side, I think just one of the important things just to realize, there is, and I've had previous speakers talking about this, about how the electrification of transport really is progressing very, very quickly. We're in this S curve now of adopting electric vehicles within the major markets. So you're doubling the sales of electric vehicles, and when you're doubling sales, it really can move very, very quickly. So you're having this big transformation in mobility, which is happening around the world, and within the region, within the Caribbean and within Guyana, we have to think of the implications of that. The grid modernization is important. Obviously, Guyana is different in terms of e-mobility compared to all the small islands in Trinidad and the Eastern Caribbean, where we are a perfect location for electric vehicles because there are no range anxiety issues here given the small land area that we have. Obviously, that's different in Guyana. The other point in Guyana I've been thinking about with economic growth, which is coming through this unprecedented economic growth through the development of the oil industry and the fact that people are buying lots of cars and it's going to outrun the road system very quickly. I think that has to be something which is a lot of care around. And then final point, just want to raise on the geopolitics. Obviously, global geopolitics influences very much what's happening within the region. We're seeing now some moves around Venezuela and potential of Venezuela now to export gas to Trinidad because of the global demand for natural gas that is now up the agenda being discussed. And just seeing today, I just saw news of John Kerry and President Maduro shaking hands in Egypt. This is quite a big change. So we're not quite sure where that's going to go. But obviously, global geopolitics then influences how things happen within the region. So I'll wrap up there.
So thank you, Dex. So David, Kerry and Maduro shaking hands in Egypt, capital markets, the link between food security and natural gas, and sort of the electrification of transport, and where do we go from here? Give us a kind of a sum up of my initial thought of how do we thread this needle.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think clearly, and thank you all, Dax, Roger, Tony, Lorraine. Everybody points to this is a great opportunity moment for Guyana and for the Caribbean as a whole in terms of managing and taking advantage of this new resource availability. And I mentioned resource availability in the generic sense because everybody has harped on the fact that this is way more than just oil and gas. And I think it's important to focus on that because way more than oil and gas means, well, what do you do with it? And particularly with the notion, whether it's 2030, whether it's 2050, whatever you agree is the end date of oil, it's maximizing what you can invest and what you can get out of this commodity and the current commodity boom, which, as we've seen from previous cycles, does not last forever, and use those resources to invest in long-standing sustainable development. We've spoken about some of those components with renewables, new areas. I think the technology aspect is critical because Guyana has that opportunity and the rest of the Caribbean to leapfrog stages. We've seen it in the telecommunications area, in terms of leapfrogging from no more landlines or investing directly into wireless technologies. But this permeates the entire economy. And that's a particularly important area of taking advantage of that because the technology is now available. It's an equalizer for all markets everywhere in the world in terms of a flat world. At the end of the day, though, however, we need to look for the challenge, overcoming the challenge of how does this pay off in the short term, not medium term. It has to be in the short term for the livelihood of Guyanese in Guyana, first and foremost, and eventually in the rest of the region. And that has to do with how are we going to use these new resources, this new technology, this linkage to some of the most competitive and benchmark private companies in the world now operating in Guyana to figure out how we get from double-digit 30 cents plus kilowatt hour and non-reliable 24/7 power to single-digit 24/7 power for Guyana and eventually for the rest of the Caribbean. This has to do with the modernization of the grids. This has to do with the modernization of utilities, leveraging these resources from oil and gas initially, but then the other feedstock areas that were mentioned. I'm very happy that Dax mentioned the initiatives in hydrogen and so on, because this is happening in many other small economies in the region. Already, El Salvador has 2 projects on hydrogen for energy in the country. So these are things that we need to start thinking of, particularly because going back to the challenge, not so much the ethnic, racial challenge, but just politics. We've seen in various countries in the region how, despite initial successful economic development initiatives, politics then trumps that, and we kind of fall back down the ladder. And I think there's a big risk in Guyana to avoid politics trumping this great economic opportunity. And unless the government, the private sector, civil society in Guyana find a way to be working as productively, as complementary as possible with these new global players in Guyana to make these benefits reach the population ASAP, short, if not immediate term, we are going to see a backlash, because at the end of the day, it just, baffles logic. If we're a top 10 energy producer and we're making all these discoveries, why can't I have energy 24/7 for schools, for hospitals, for just my daily life? I'm willing to pay for it. But if I can't have it, what will happen? Final point, we are seeing in other so-called advanced developed economies in the region, most recently Puerto Rico with its energy crisis, the development of microgrids. And I'm wondering if that is not something that in Guyana we need to start looking at, particularly for hinterland regions and so on, where anything to do with a new utility or gas to power and so on is not going to reach them initially. So again, the new technologies allow for those microgrids, and we need to figure out the regulatory, the legal aspects so that all these new initiatives can be brought into that new energy framework in Guyana. Let me stop there. I know we've got a very active question and commentary section, Terence. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, David. And I wanted just to start there. I mean, one of the questions that popped in from David, and I was hoping perhaps to give Lorraine the sort of first dibs on this one, but it seems that maybe her internet has kind of dropped out. So maybe I'm going to start with Roger here. So, what is your thought on this question of, this interest in selling back energy to the grid, and what it means, or at least to offer some thought of what it might mean in the context of Guyana, and to David's point of microgrids as we kind of look to do things in a rural environment. Give us some thought in this regard.
I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think selling back to the grid is an interesting idea. I personally would not focus on it near term. I think what David said is, we've got to deliver near term benefits, like significant near term benefits. I think I would focus more on getting the gas to shore, and accepting that it's not going to be sort of perfect. I think there's an expression in the U.S.: "Don't let the good be get in the way of perfect, or perfect get in the way of good." So I think there's a lot of value to be delivered to Guyana near term on getting that gas to shore and then playing that out. In general, folks prefer to, and we see this in the developed world, but I think you see it elsewhere. Folks would prefer to have things like power, water, gas in our case for heating in New England as a utility service. My wife says, I don't have time to spend to think about that. I want you to do it. But to get there, it has to be, as Bill Gates says, electricity is only valuable if it's always there. it becomes, a lot of our business, when we're successful, it becomes back of mind. So focus on that. And then the system will be able to absorb, folks that want to sell into the grid, that want to participate on that. And David, to your point on microgrids, absolutely. We built the largest battery microgrid in the world in Provincetown at the tip of Cape Cod. We disconnect from the mainland, and it runs 10,000 people. And I think that's a great resource for the what I remember as a kid is called interior. You put solar with batteries, and we're building that out in Massachusetts for resiliency. That's a great resource if you're an interior, as opposed to pretending you're going to run transmission all the way down to the border with Brazil. Put those microgrids in, you get an immediate benefit, and then maybe over time they get connected to the greater grid or not.
So the question of benefit is one that has sort of popped up, and this is a question I want to put to the entire panel. So as I've read sort of the Guyanese news reports and papers and so on, there is still some element of, does the gas to shore is it the best option for us? And a question sort of emerged along those lines. And so I want to maybe take a moment, because it seems in a weird way this conversation is driving itself always towards this question of how do we strengthen the electricity infrastructure? And so here's a question that sort of emerges from Andrew Brandley, and first, I can't, but really the essential point is, does it make sense? Is it the best? Is it the best option for us? And I want to kind of ask you to make an argument for it in some very ways.
I'll just use one word. Yes, absolutely. And I'm happy to amplify on that.
Yeah. So go ahead. The floor is yours.
I think we should turn it over to our colleagues. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Okay.
I was just going to say on this point, the cost of importing LNG compared to pipeline gas, being exported from associated gases, this is two completely different things. It will be far, far, far more expensive to go to import LNG. Also, you have to store natural gas. How are you going to store that natural gas is not a very easy thing to do. So, importing large volumes of LNG when you have natural gas as associated gas available, the economics are just simply not there. So, no, it makes much more sense to use the gas that you have, the associated gas from your oil fields, which will be a lot cheaper source of energy for Guyana than importing LNG.
So actually, for following up on that, there's a thought from Trevor James around he environment naturally, in a sense, he's saying it lends itself to a kind of distributed these microgrids. And so the question that I would ask is there any microgrid approach? Is there any bottom-up approach in the is there a way to ensure that there is a kind of broad participation somehow in the gas to shore project? Is there some mechanism that can flow in that direction, that is energy security, that is bottom up, that is not top down? It seems one of those areas that is that needs some kind of management.
One of the areas I think, Terence, is that in order for initiatives like this, as Trevor James is mentioning, to function, it's that other part of the economy in Guyana, the non-energy environment, financing, credit, all these issues which are being built up at the same time. So part of the opportunity, but also part of the challenge, is we are walking and chewing gum and dancing soca and singing calypso all at the same time in Guyana, because everything is just coming together all at once. So in a way, from the positive sense, it's a perfect storm. We just had the announcement, a Guyanese diaspora, a private sector entrepreneur, Floyd Haynes, just announced the first merchant bank in Guyana by diaspora capital. So it's beginning to make these things available to people so that they can then empower themselves to use them. And it doesn't take a lot to set up your own mini grid in a hinterland area and so on, because what people are facing is a challenge. It makes no sense. People all over Guyana are on a smartphone doing Twitter and Instagram, and they can't have 24/7 lights so that children can do their homework. I mean, we've got to figure out a way around that, or else somewhere it's going to break, and it's going to break in a bad way. So yes, you facilitate credit, you facilitate investment, you make amends, as we discussed in one of these webinars with the diaspora initiatives the government is doing, so that the diaspora can bring back expertise, resources, and that the government is not just thinking of them to tax them. They're not thinking of them as a cash cow for more things, but as an investment back into the country. And with that, you begin to get things going. But those opportunities need to be provided, because not everybody is going to produce 25-year Demerara rum. We need to, that's the reality. There are people who just need to do basics of life. Wake up, have breakfast, go to work, come back home, wash the clothes, prepare dinner, and for that they need 24/7 water and electricity. That's the bottom line.
So,
Christian, if I can jump in on that,
Yeah.
I think David and I see things very similarly. It seems where there's a high population density, centralize it, sort of build that infrastructure for the use of everyone. I mean, in reality, is businesses, individuals. Their first preference for most people, not for everyone, is not to spending time thinking about this. 24/7, electricity works. You get so many benefits, both to individuals of all socioeconomic means, to businesses, to high value economic activity. Boston has sort of the highest value add businesses within the US. And it's all reliant on electricity. I mean, I looked at some of the numbers, the multipliers, 150, 200 to 1, which says, as long as the electricity is there, these are all the great things I can do with it, including healthcare, education, communications. So where is high population density? Focus on delivering that to everyone within that area, of whatever economic means they are, as well as a great communication system.
Yeah.
Where decentralized where you have low population densities, maybe that's appropriate.
Go ahead.
So I just want to jump in on one additional way in which people can participate. So which is through ownership. So there's no reason why you can't list a gas processing facility on a stock exchange and allow local pension funds or people to invest in it. We've got in Trinidad the gas processing, Phoenix Park Gas Processors is partly listed on the Trinidad Stock Exchange. So lots of people own a shareholding in it, and that's a way to have a different way of a involvement in these utilities.
So I wanted to.
I don't want to.
No, Professor Brown, go ahead.
Yeah, let me put it this way: that everything I've heard in the last few minutes, particularly David's comment, and now Dax's, goes back to a point that I made on the slides. Put people first.
Yes, I was coming to this point, Professor.
That is the whole thing, and not only ethnic groups, but simply the fact that, as I say, if you raise public expectations in the way that I'm hearing it in Guyana, and that I read it every day, hey, we're the best in the world in this, we're the fastest growing this, we're this. People are going to say, well, what is in it for me? Has my lifestyle changed? That conundrum is going to come. And I think from the point of view of governance, that has to be an issue that is tackled in a very short space of time. David is correct. You create tremendous disruption if people's expectations are not realized. So don't raise the expectations too high. Provide the basics. I have a problem. Dax, when I'm in Trinidad, as I am every 6 months or 6 months, what I find is that there is somehow a problem with the government in dealing with, I'm talking about roads, I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about transportation, things like that. And you don't want to ever get to that stage. My father always used to put it to me, he says, in government are not domestic. All right. And by that he means, pay attention to people's needs first. I think this is a lesson that we've got to see at this particular point of
Yeah. Professor Barton, I want to push you. Actually, I read a very interesting article this week by author Mosa Telford in the Stabroek News, and it was titled sort of like something about "Will the poor eat the rich?" or something of this sort. And it speaks to a kind of growing, or at least as the author saw it, a kind of growing, hardening of the divide. And so I wanted to come to you about this question on the slide, as you articulated. You want to put all Guyanese first and Caribbean people first, and then to kind of articulate a vision for what you meant by saying, you want all ethnic groups to be equal in this trajectory. Already it seems that some things are hardening, and just given your experience, I wanted you to kind of offer a few thoughts that would kind of get us unstuck in this regard.
How much are you willing to pay me in order to do that?
I'm sure there's enough to pay you to do this.
So these things are attitudes take generations to change. Okay, I think when I look at our own country of Trinidad and Tobago, I think we've gone a long way into evening some of these things. It's the politicians who make the problem, by the risk card and all the rest of it. But we've got to get beyond that. We've got to think of, as it were, the sort of the common good. If you do a project that is for the common good, why, when you change a government, do you have to come in and stop the project and start it all over again? Because you didn't make money on the initial project? What is it? We had a number of cases in Trinidad with that sort of thing. So part of the equation, Terence, is corruption. This is part of the equation. Corruption that derives the population at large of a lot of the benefits that they could be having. This is not a problem that's unique to Guyana. It's all over the world. But these are some of the things that we have got to try to negate, that we've got to try to lessen, because they're not doing us any good. Now, when I thought, I go back to my point, it takes generations to change. I don't know that we have that amount of time, but some of the things we can do is not raise expectations to a level where you cannot meet, what you have promised, or doing things too quickly and too fast in the hope that they really materialize. A lot of them do not, and those are basic conundrums that we face.
Hey, Terence, if I could comment on some of the things that Dax brought up, I thought they were fascinating. Dax, some of the things that you brought up that really resonated with me is the appreciation for how important fossil fuel is for food. And if you're a reader, I recommend How the World Really Works by Vaclav Smil. And he lays out sort of 4 foundations of modern society. And Dax has definitely read the book. But yeah, food is a very sort of basic human need. And if you sort of play that thread out, you get the gas to shore. You can create either food that is needed for the world, because Guyana is continental. Or you can create a commodity that's exportable. It's not necessarily LNG. It's Trinidad's done a nice job at exporting methane and ammonia and derivatives off of gas. And the other point that you raised, Dax, that really resonated with me is there's a lot of technological trends going on around the world that you don't have to drive. You can go along for the ride. The other one I think of is batteries. We've developed battery technology and application quite well in the U.S. I mentioned the Provincetown battery. Just steal that stuff. You don't have to spend all your time developing the technology. It's being developed for a variety of reasons around the world. The other that I focus on is I have a background in telecommunications. If I was czar, I would give everyone free broadband. You get access to so much education, information, and connection to the world. You're able to leverage sort of educational history of Guyana and the language. I mean, come on, we're a continental country that is Anglo-Saxon. What a gift. And you inject energy into that. So anyway, those are some of the things that resonated off of your comments, Dax.
Roger, just thinking, building on that there's this nearshoring opportunity with the US concern about its supply chains into the renewable energy sector at the moment as well. So I think that is a major opportunity area for Guyana from its mining sector, and that is something which I think also should be high on the agenda.
I mean, on that one of the things I think about is geopolitically, the U.S. should be all in on Guyana. And it has such geopolitical importance to the U.S. If I had to say it, the State Department, I would ramp up U.S. sort of presence and emphasis on the geopolitical importance of Guyana with all these things going on.
Roger, going on that point, the Venezuelans are not going to invade Guyana now. Guyana has too much leverage internationally, and certainly with the United States. Terence, I know the article that you talked about, and the quote from that is very relevant. The guy says, "We can't drink the oil, but we certainly want a taste of it." Okay, that I think is the capsule idea. We certainly want a taste of it. In other words, give us something from it. David Lewis is right. He raised the whole issue quite frankly. Thank you.
Could I, Terence? Could I? Sorry, just to on Anthony's point there. One of the things that I think Guyana has to be really careful about is how it puts in place subsidies based upon the revenue which is coming in, and that has been disastrous in Trinidad with our transport fuel subsidies, and it's created us huge problems, which we have to now try to find a way out of. So you have to look to the long term while you're making sure that people, what people want is always not what's good for them. So subsidizing fuel for people to put in internal combustion engines now would be a bad policy idea in Guyana. We did it in Trinidad. It's been disastrous. And I think that Guyana should think about how it uses the revenue to subsidize mobility so people can move around, but not through private motor vehicles.
But Dax, I think that's a really key point. My vote would be give them infrastructure.
So actually,
exactly.
as we're the time always seems to run away from me on this, but you raised the point which I wanted to raise from Professor Bryan's. He one of his sort of action items for Guyana had to do with being able to compete internationally, and so I wanted to raise the question of if you're competing internationally, to what extent do we want to subsidize various areas of the economy in ways which could potentially be anti-competitive, and so you've just kind of hit on the head, and I want you to sort of we're close on the end, and I want you just to take 1 minute to kind of give a kind of closing remarks. So we'll start with Roger, and then Dax, and then Professor Bryan, just to kind of close this out. This tension between the need for something now and the need and this sort of sense that something now makes you less strong further along, and how do you balance this tension, because that is clearly emerging and in some places hardening.
I mean, Terrence, my vote would be sort of build a foundation on which people can really be effective. I had a conversation with a pretty well-known senior person in the U.S. government that did a lot of stuff overseas. And we were talking about this racial divide. And his advice is find one thing that gives something to everyone. And some of those things that I think of is healthcare. Build the absolutely best healthcare system. Everyone can get on board with that. Education. Build the best education system. Leverage the fact that you've got access to the world's knowledge through a high-speed telecom system. Build infrastructure like telecom. We mentioned roads. Give everyone reliable electricity. Give everyone clean water. Build that foundation. Really sort of build that foundation where it's rock solid and it's available to everyone. It's not if you're rich or you're poor, you can generate your own electricity. It's afforded to everyone. And it's a basic foundation as being part of the country. And then build from there. Those are sort of my thoughts.
Thank you. Dax?
Well, that was so perfect. I don't want to add anything to it because I just want to say I agree entirely with what Roger just said. And that's it. I don't want to spoil it by saying anything more.
I will only add one thing. I mean, as I made the point of looking long-term into the future, okay? It strikes me a country like Guyana is perfect for the development of an inter-borough, inter-county rapid rail system. In other words, electricity used to do that sort of thing. I know there are topographical problems perhaps, but in areas where you're dealing with flatland, with Georgetown and areas beyond, look at innovation like that. This is something we should have done in Trinidad years ago. Instead of that, what we did, we put a whole set of gas-driven buses on the road, which are killing us. We said, oh, it's too expensive to do a rapid rail. In the long term, it's cheap. So I would conclude by saying what the guy said before, which is we can't drink the oil. Need a little taste of it, man.
So I suppose this is something that's the David. So as you kind of give us some closing, bring us to a close, I share the sort of thoughts that Dave Rohe said. We need to build for the future, which is why our youth is so vital. We can't face all of the challenges in 1 or 2 decades. So give us a closing thought that kind of encapsulates sort of Dave's thinking, and I guess we're literally at the end of our time. So
I think the pepper pot is perfect. I don't want to spoil it. I will just make one comment. This is all about, as Roger mentioned, providing the best available public goods to the population. We all talk about people saying, oh, let's look at Sweden, Finland, and so on. Well, that's what they did. They maximized and monetized these resources, made them available as investments, not expenses, investments in public goods, health, water, electricity, education, and so on. And that then drove innovation. Innovation drives development. Development provides stability, and stability provides reliability, resilience, and sustainability. So at the end of the day, what good is having all these resources if you do not provide more and better public goods?
Well, thank you. I think on that note, it's sort of an end. And I forgot. I just wanted to say a short personal, take the prerogative of the moderator to say a short personal good day to my dad, who's kind of managing a few challenges at this moment. So I just wanted to say hello, Dad. I know who's watching the thing.
The earlier generation. Very good.
You guys have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you very, very much. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you all.
guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye. So that was good. Yeah.